Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out Linode. With private networking, shared block storage, node balancers, and a 200 gigabit network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale. Go to podcastinit.com/Linode to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And visit the site at podcastinit.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, and read the show notes. Your host as usual is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Joe Mancuso about Masonite, the modern and developer-centric Python web framework. So, Joe, could you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Joe Mancuso, like you just said. I'm a developer for about 10 years now. I started out as a kid when I was 14 years old. I'm 24 now. And I just have a love and a passion for developing software and projects.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
So I started out when I was 14 with the normal HTML, CSS, the whole front end stuff. And then I introduced myself to PHP, and I've been into that for pretty much until I joined the military and all that at 18 to 22. And when I was 22, I got introduced to Python and Django. Python, I just wanted to learn Python just to learn Python. So I went to the whole Code Academy thing and kind of introduced myself. And then I knew PHP so well at the time that learning a new language became natural. So, and Python is so beginner friendly and intuitive that it only took me like a month to sort of master it. And then I got into Django. I did that for about a year. And that's how I got introduced to the Python world.
And you recently started the Masonite project. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about what it is and what was your motivation for creating it in the first place.
So what Masonite is, it's a batteries included Python web framework that's going to rival Django. So a lot of the time we kind of compare Masonite and Django and how Masonite might fit in, but I'm kind of designing it to compete directly with it. So, eventually, hopefully there'll be maybe Flask and Masonite, and Django can be third. We'll see. But
that's an ambitious goal.
Yeah, it has to be. When you're trying to overtake the unmoved movers in the Python community, it's you got to put Masonite somewhere and then just try to achieve and try to get it to that place. So, but the thing is that it's kind of redefining what batteries included is. It's more of a batteries included like Laravel is a batteries included. So Django might not have things that you might need. So you might not have, for example, S3 might not be built in. You might not have notifications built in, like text message notifications or email notifications or database notifications. So all that's sort of being built into the Masonite framework. So you really just do what you need to do and use the semantics of Masonite itself. So and that's something else I want to explain about Masonite is sort of where I see Masonite fitting in, like I said before, where I'm sort of putting it in a place and trying to get it there. I'm sort of picturing how Django is like an IBM and then Flask is like a HP, right? In the 70s and 80s. And Masonite is like an Apple. So you're trying to move these unmoved movers and trying to liven up the community at the same time. So that's sort of where I see it. So Masonite, the reason why I compare Masonite to Apple is because the word Masonite comes from Masonite board, which Masonite board is what artists use to put their artwork on. So it sort of like flattens it to create like a hardboard. And so that's where I want to think of Masonite framework, is that the framework is a place where you could put your artwork on and sort of just like a normal framework, right? We're building this art and we're using these tools to build this art. And so with that kind of artsy and creative feel, it has things like craft commands, which are used to basically scaffold the application for you. And with the craft command, actually, when I originally started Masonite, I found this, or this developer found me, who is like an artist, I think. I don't even think he was a developer. I think he was an artist. And he wanted to develop a logo for it. So I was like, great. So we did a call, and he showed me like these concepts. And they're all like of cauldrons and like brooms and like witchcraft. And that's what he thought when he thought of craft commands, was these like witchcraft commands, like you're crafting something. So, but the way I want it for people to look at Masonite and using these craft commands is that you're crafting a controller, you're crafting a class the same way like a blacksmith might craft a sword or a chainmail or something. So that's sort of where Masonite is, and sort of where it should fit into the ecosystem, and what I'm trying to achieve by creating it.
And when reading through the documentation, it's clear that you put a lot of thought into the architectural principles and software design with things like the inversion of control containers and dependency injection built into the core of the framework. So I'm curious what your inspirations were for other projects or frameworks that you were looking to for trying to see what would make for a reasonable and robust target for being able to use as a foundation for your new project.
So the architectural design principles that I sort of took from other projects was Laravel. So Laravel obviously has the an IOC container, and the entire framework is kind of built around this IOC container. And they have this like auto-resolving dependency injections. They have all these like design principles and the manager pattern and stuff like that. So when I originally, the original foundation of the project was I just wanted to learn what the heck a WSGI was. So I basically started going way back to the beginning, and kind of the build up to the architecture was I built everything. Let's go back a little bit more. So the way WSGI works is you have this kind of entry point, right? So it could be Gunnicorn, it could be Waitress. So you have this entry point where it passes basically a dictionary into whatever function that you want. So inside this function, typically called the app function, is all the logic for it. So it could have the route parameters, and it could have the cookies and all that stuff. And inside that function is where you put all your magic, or not your magic, your framework stuff, or your guts. And you can sort of abstract it away. You can import classes into this and do whatever you want there. So what I did was, to learn all of this, I put every single thing inside this function. So this function was like maybe 500 lines long, and that was the framework. And to make modifications, you had to make modifications to this giant function. And I thought it was cool. I mean, it was doing cool things. It was just completely unmaintainable. And it was actually inside the project itself. So if I needed to like upgrade the application, you had to make a whole new application. So there were sort of these learning principles. But I thought it was cool, so I put it on Reddit, and it was called like version 0.3, and it got completely demolished. All right, everybody hated it because it was sort of cool. I got some cool feedback, but everybody said like it's completely broken, and it's never going to be a thing. Which stuff like that drives me. So what I did, and one of the recommendations and the feedback I got was that it wasn't modular at all, and I really didn't understand the concept of modular. So I went to other frameworks for inspiration. So I went to Laravel, Django, Rails, and I just previously came from the Laravel world. So I had that mindset of service providers and the IOC container and a providers list, or an array, right, from Laravel. And so I sort of built like these principles, and it was actually turning out into something cool. So that went up to like a 1.3 release was the first time it actually had like an IOC container. And the reason why I wanted to do that and put it there was I saw, as I'm developing something, right, the best way to learn something, I think, is to actually develop it from scratch. So then you know exactly how it works, and you know exactly where things will break and what's the strength and what the weakness is. So as I'm developing all this stuff, it's like slowly turning out to be awesome, and I'm starting to see the power of it. And I'm starting to take little pieces of the application and test it. So that's why it went from like 20% testability to like now I think we're at like 92%. So the framework is really, really well tested. It's actually really, really stable. And it's at the 2.0 release, which is really good. And so, yeah, so I learned that like the IOC container is extremely testable because you could load things into this container. And for those of you that don't know what an IOC container is, should I go into detail on that?
I can add links in the show notes for people who want to dive deeper on it. But if you want to just give a quick overview of sort of the principle.
Okay, sure. So a brief overview and how at least it works in Masonite is there's a class called, it's called the app actually, but it's actually a container. That's what it's called, but it is a container. So you have this dictionary inside this class that has every single class that you need inside a dictionary. So now you could use this container to fetch things out of. So say you loaded an upload driver for loading things onto the file system. So you have your sort of your API that you use for that. But if you want it to do maybe Amazon S3, you simply just take it out and put in an S3 driver. And you just swapped out the whole functionality of your code. That's simple. So yeah, just a container is you just load things into it and then you fetch things out of it when you need it. Now, what's even more powerful was what I saw was the dependency injection, which is doing the exact same thing, but all it's doing is before it calls your controller method, it's just reading your parameter list and then just fetching things for you. So you basically load it into your parameter list. So you might, like in Django, you have like a request, right? So with Masonite, you would put the request there, but Masonite is actually injecting it for you into that. So you can put anything you want there. So you can put an upload driver there. You can do whatever you want, and it'll inject it for you, and it knows exactly what you need. It's more powerful than just simply importing classes because it's swappable now. So you could add a service provider from a third-party package that kind of adds functionality to your framework or swaps it out or adds methods to a driver that's already there. So it's two really, really powerful concepts. And I really think it's a superior architecture for frameworks just because there's such a reliance on testability. And it's almost harder not to test Masonite than it is to test it. So like it's just so easy that you have to do it. Django, it's a little bit harder. It's not built in a way that's testable, right? It's like it was built in 2006, I think, or 2003, or I think it's 2006, and it just kind of evolved, and it uses some strange principles. So it's just kind of evolved over time into this thing that I don't think is good. I mean, it's great. I mean, Django is really good, but I think Masonite has the potential to overtake that spot. And people that use it have nothing but good things to say about it. Like, so once you use Masonite, you're kind of hooked into it. Everything sort of makes sense.
And so, as you mentioned, one of the aspects of Masonite that makes it appealing is this easy pluggability and extensibility. And in general, one of the things that has helped Django maintain its momentum and its relative lead in the web framework space for Python is the community contributions and community modules. So I'm wondering how much engagement you've seen from the general community as far as creating new plugins or some of the interesting uses that people have put Masonite to.
So I've been I fully understand that, and I know that a framework is really only as good. There's two things that make a framework good, I think. One is the community around it, absolutely. So someone who has a really good community for someone who has a really bad community, the project that has a really good community always wins, no matter what. And the second thing that makes a framework good, or a package good, in my opinion, is that nobody cares how many features are in your framework. Nobody cares what your framework can do. Nobody cares. The only thing that people care is how are they going to interact with that framework. So if they get to a certain part in the framework where it's too hard or it doesn't make sense, they're just going to revert back to like what they know, and it's almost harder to learn something new than it is to not learn something new. Masonite has a really, really simple API, so once you're going through each step, everything just feels natural and it just falls into place, and you're knowing how things interact with other things, and you're abstracting things by its very nature, just because it's very, very easy to do to abstract things in Masonite. So yeah, so the pluggability of the framework is actually really big. When I develop a new package, it really only takes me like a day to do what I have to do, just because I could literally basically code a project and then create a single entry point for that project called the service provider. And then anybody can plug that into their application. And all it's doing is, all you have to do to develop a package for Masonite is load classes into the container. Like that's it. That's all you have to do to connect a project to Mason, or a package to Masonite. Everything else, like the user in your documentation, you could tell the user, okay, you have to take this out of the container, use it to interact like this, and so on and so forth. So like recently, I just created a notifications package, and I just implemented Nexmo, which is a text message service. So now I can send texts right from my project, and it took me like a day to implement the entire thing for text messaging, and I only code at night too, so it really only took me like maybe 4 hours to code these packages. So it's really simple. The documentation is super, super extensible from the beginning of the project, from like point oh 0.03. I knew that documentation was huge. Like I needed to have a really, really well documented package. And so if you need any like questions or how to implement things, you can just read the documentation. If you have any questions, I'm super, super active in the community. You can join the Slack channel, which is slack.masoniteproject.com, and you can join there and you can ask any questions. The community is pretty active when it's active, right? So when everybody's sort of on. We have two maintainers, me and this developer named Abram, and we answer pretty much any questions that come in.
And that's one thing that I definitely noted as I was researching for this interview is that, as you mentioned, the documentation is very complete, and reading through it was very well put together. So it was easy to try and see how you might use different aspects of the project. And some of the features that stood out as being somewhat unique, at least within the Python landscape, is the built in support for the asynchronous tasks for one, but also for WebSocket support using things like Pusher. Whereas for a lot of the other web frameworks, there is additional dependencies required for being able to have some of that dynamic bidirectional communication within the framework.
Right, and I think that's why Masonite. I kind of coined the term of the modern developer Python web framework and developer centric, because I mean things like that. I have a principle that things should be taken out of a framework rather than put into a framework. So if you don't use something, since Masonite is so extendable, all you have to do is remove the import of the provider, and you don't have it in your package anymore, in your project. So I'd much rather take things out than sort of take maybe an hour to implement things, and I'd rather have it there and then be able to add more to it than for it to not be there and you have to implement it in the first place. As for the documentation, I have this concept early on that there's a developer on YouTube named Matthias Peterson, I think it is, and he's the fun function guy. He just took over dev tips, I think, and he has this concept of no commits without tests. So if you're trying to implement tests in your project and your team, the best way to do that is to say don't commit this code until you have a test for it. So what my ideology is that no pull requests without documentation. So I try to make it extremely extensible. So I have like basically a staging branch where I list all the features as like what I call a running change log. And right next to each feature, I have a little checkbox that says documentation. And once I document something, I'll check it. And once everything has checks, then I'll merge it in. So that makes things super easy, and everything is there. Like every single part of the framework should be documented just by that very nature.
And I also noticed that Masonite only supports Python 3, so I'm curious if there are any particular features of the 3.x releases that you're leveraging in Masonite that you found particularly useful as you were developing and evolving it.
So Masonite originally started out trying to support as many things as possible. And I realized that it was actually really hard to do that. And because if I tried to support 2.7, and 3.3 plus, let's say, once 4 comes out, then I'm in like a predicament. Like the projects I started out, a decade ago, are facing those problems today, because now you have 3.7 coming out, you have all these new Python versions coming out. Most of them are pretty backwards compatible, but trying to support two completely different major versions was going to be too much. And I figured if anybody's going to use this project today, might as well start out with the best technology. So I started out with 3.3 plus, just because the packages I was using, those were supported. Those are the minimum supported versions. So as I'm adding packages, I have to ensure that it also supports the minimum Python versions I'm doing. So it started out with 3.3, and then I added, I think, a cryptography package, which only supported 3.4. So the sort of ideology we're coming from is support at least 4 packages in a row. So when 3.8 comes out, we're going to drop support for 3.4. Not saying that the code will break on 3.4, but we're not going to intentionally, we're going to remove it from the Travis tests, essentially, and just do 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's nothing, as for what it's using in 3, it's just using the normal standard packages in 3. I mean, nothing crazy that might break in 2. I mean, the major difference between 2 and 3 is really the renaming of various built-in packages and package support, external package support. What it is using, what it is using is annotations. That's actually a huge part of Masonite. Is not a huge part, but it has. So basically, what you for automatic dependency injection, going back a little bit, you can put. So say you have your method class, right, which is starts with self, and then you have comma, and then whatever you put there needs to correspond to a key of the dictionary in the container. So if you have request, it looks for the request key in the dictionary in the container and injects that class that's attached to it. So basically, right, so that's lookup by key. To look up by value, what if I don't know the key? I could look up by the class itself. So if I want to get an upload driver, I can use an annotation where I have request colon, and then normally you have like a string annotation. What you could do is you could just put a class there. So to look up that class. So that's actually a huge part of Python 3. I think that was introduced in annotations, I think was introduced in 3.0. So we're using that, and that's huge. But what's also huge for dependency injection is that it seems a little bit weird, to me at least, to fetch by class or by key. So what's even more powerful is what if you fetch by like a base class? So all upload drivers inherit from a upload contract, which is just a class, really, like an interface almost. If you're coming from PHP, I don't know if Ruby has it or not, but an interface. So you're inheriting from that class. So if we basically annotate a upload contract, it'll give me the upload driver. So I can basically take out all drivers from the framework, replace it with any class I want. And as long as I'm uploading from or inheriting from the upload contract, it'll give me a class that can upload. So we're leveraging Python annotations a lot, but you don't have to use it. It's just a feature.
And for somebody who is starting a new project, if they don't necessarily have Python as their sort of decided language implementation, if they're just shopping around for a given framework, what are some of the features of Masonite that might make it stand out and help drive somebody to use Masonite as a framework and Python as a language versus some of the other available options that they might be considering?
So the major difference between a Django selection and a Masonite selection is that they're really coming from 2 completely different worlds, which is weird to say because they're basically implementing the same thing, right? They're basically, Django is to build, software applications on the web, and Masonite is to build software applications on the web. But they're coming from 2 different paradigms where you should really pick the one that makes sense for you, and not necessarily the one that's better or it just, if you're building an application, it needs to make sense what the heck you're doing. If you've ever used Django and you're sort of like, it seems like a little too magical for you, you ever ask yourself, why are we doing it this way? This seems weird to me. Then you should definitely try out Masonite. If you're coming from a different language, like I get a lot of developers from Ruby and Laravel. And if you're coming from those languages, everything sort of just makes sense to you because it uses a similar architecture. The ORM, every other Python web framework uses a data mapper ORM, which basically means you're going to specify your attributes or your columns on your table as attributes on your class. So you're basically, the way I look at it is you're mapping, a data mapper ORM is mapping from the model to the table. So you make the model look like the table essentially. And with Masonite, I kind of went on a limb here and I'm using a active record style ORM, which an active record style makes the method or the model sort of replicate the table. So because of that, we can separate the model from the migrations completely. So which we do. So you could basically remove the ORM if you want to, and sort of replace it with your own ORM. There's no reason to do that. I think Python developers, once they get a taste of active record, they're gonna love it, and I think they're gonna like it a lot more. As with migrations and stuff, migrations are completely separated. Django uses the MTV structure for MVC, their own interpretation of it. Masonite maintains the traditional MVC. So maybe a quick sort of similarity would be Masonite has what's called controllers, right? The C in the MVC. And Django has function-based views and class-based views. That would sort of be the C, right? So there's, for those listeners that are sort of getting into it, there's four, if you've learned this in college, there's four architectural concepts of any application. There's business logic, presentation logic, data accession logic, and data storage. So the developer community sort of took those data accession, business, and presentation logic, and they sort of created this MVC structure. And various libraries and frameworks, and you got Vue and Node and all that. They sort of took it, and Swift. They sort of took it and they kind of ran with it. So now you have things like MVVM, MVT, MVVC, like all this kind of crazy stuff. So it's really just a different paradigm. And to give a little bit of a better example, for those of you, I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with Django, so I keep on going back to Django. So with Django, you have function-based views and class-based views. So a class-based view is basically like an abstraction of a function-based view. So what a function-based view is just a function, it takes a request, it returns a response. And a class-based view does sort of the same thing, but it has like a lot of framework hooks you could tie into it and inherit from, and different template views and all that stuff, and mix-ins. So with Masonite, it's actually a lot simpler than that. It's really just a class. That's it. Just a controller. A controller is just a class. And inside this class, there are these methods. And these methods return various views. So a class-based view might work on a single template, where a controller itself works on an entire feature. So you might have like a setting controller, which works on all your settings. And your various methods at a class-based view might be like get and post. But in Masonite, your methods will be show, store, delete, right? On these settings, it might be show profile. It might be show leagues if you're creating like some sort of like a sports-based thing. Show teams, and you're sort of encapsulating all your feature logic into this one class, and you could abstract out as many classes as you want. Django sort of does a higher level where they have like apps. You can abstract out entire apps which have their own models and stuff like that. And if that like makes sense to you, I mean, more power to you. It's weird to me and a lot of other developers. So a lot of people that use Masonite, everything just clicks to them. So if you're coming from, if you want something different, then you should definitely try out Masonite, essentially.
Yeah, when I was looking through how the applications were architected, it reminded me a lot of Rails, because that's what I have experience with. I haven't used Laravel to be able to have that comparison in mind, but the whole idea of the conventions being very strong for being able to structure your application rather than having to define a lot of configuration to tie things together, and having the easy scaffolding commands for being able to create different portions of your application to help get things moving quickly. And then also the active record style ORM to make it very sort of literate style in terms of when you're interacting with your model objects and the traditional MVC structure. So anybody who's coming from that type of application environment and wants to experience it in Python, it definitely seems like it would feel very natural and familiar. And for somebody who has decided that they want to use Masonite for a new project, what does their workflow look like for getting it started and iterating on the development? And how does that differ if they're coming into an existing project and want to add new features to Masonite?
So from the beginning, so the installation is fairly straightforward. I mean, the workflow is a little strange. So not strange, but it's different than probably what a lot of Python developers using Django or Flask are familiar with. So you're basically installing a command line tool to your computer, which has like 3 commands, which has like a new command, an install command, and a package command, I think. So once you have this tool, it's going to be your best friend. So I'm sure those of you that are coming from Laravel or Ruby or Rails, it's probably a little bit different because the command line, I believe, is attached to your actual application. So like in Laravel, it has like an artisan command, right? And that's in like an artisan.php file or something like that in the base of your directory. So you're gonna kind of execute it using a PHP command, so PHP artisan. With craft, you're installing the command line to your computer, so you could do craft new in any directory, right? And you're installing it there. I think Laravel actually even has their own command line application, but you're always going to be using it. So you're never going to do like, so if you're using like a Laravel new, and then you go into your application, you do like a PHP artisan, you're always going to be using craft with Masonite. So you do a craft new, and then when you're inside an application directory, it's actually going to pull in commands from that application itself. So, it might be different depending on what application you're using, and the commands might be different depending on if the developer who built the package added those commands to begin with. I mean, you have all your basic applications, right? All right, you have all your basic commands, and then so that's a little bit different. As for an existing project, a developer in the community built what he called Masonite forums, and it was basically a Quora type Q&A. And so I was like, you know what, I'm gonna build some features onto this application that he built because it's super cool. So I git cloned everything, and I did it comes with a craft install command. So I craft installed, which installs all the dependencies and generates a secret key. And I got his project up and running in maybe a minute to 2 minutes. So when you're coming from an existing application, it's actually it's the exact same thing, right? You just have your application there, and you could switch between them easily. I always do it inside a virtual environment, which makes things a little more simple. So as for the actual workflow, normally if you're coming from Django, you might create a class that you inherit from a class-based view. You might create an actual function. You might go in and create a route. And then once you do that, you'll create a template. So for the workflow when starting a project and for sort of developing the project, you're using this craft command to actually scaffold your application. So you're probably really annoyed at, okay, now I have to go create a class-based view. So let's create a class, name this, let's import this. So with Masonite, you're just doing craft controller, and then you give your controller name. So craft controller dashboard controller. And it'll create a class for you and put it in the correct folder, and you can move it wherever you want after if you need to. But so it sort of makes developing applications quick, and things start happening quickly. And that's actually the feedback I got a lot was, wow, this makes things happen fast. That's sort of the feedback I get. So if you need to create so in any route, right, you create a route, you create a controller, you create a view, or a template if you're coming from Django, you create a view, and you kind of sort of connect those three. So with craft, you can create a template, super easy, create it, or a view, same thing. You can create your controller, which adds a little method for you that you could start developing. And as for your route, all you have to do is really just create that route or connect that route to the controller. And that's it. That's all you got to do. So it makes things happen quickly. So you don't have to be like, all right, where was I again? Now that I have everything set up, oh, right, I wanted to create a dashboard. So it's not, so it's really, really easy to get started. And also Masonite has, which this is really subjective. I know a lot of Python developers might not like it, but they don't have to use it. So they can remove it from the application if they want to. But there is a service provider that ships with Masonite called a helpers provider. And what this helpers actually connects with the Python built-ins and actually adds built-ins to your application. So just like you do a print statement, right, print parentheses, you would do a view parentheses. You don't have to import It's sort of coming from a little bit of a magical place, but it's super fast to like scaffold something. So if you want to just do view and then you return a view and just make sure it works, then you're good. And you create all the logic around it and it works. And then you can sort of, a minute after, you can go back and restructure and rescaffold it or refactor it and all that stuff. So it makes things happen really, really quick. And that's a lot of the feedback I got.
And as you continue to work on the Masonite framework, what are some of the plans that you have for it in going into the future, both for the core project itself and for any additional plugins that you plan to incorporate into it or provide sort of in addition to it?
So the future of the framework, like I said, I see it at the top right next to Django, right before Django actually, right? Django will be after. And Flask, I don't care where Flask is, since it's sort of a micro framework. So to compare Masonite to a micro framework is a little unfair. But they're both batteries included frameworks. So once I see it there and I'm working on it every day, I add issues to the GitHub repository. I create articles for it constantly, right? I'm huge into the documentation part. And the future for it is I'm creating various applications with it. So I'm only creating packages when I need them. So like the notifications package, like I needed that in my application. And it's super, super simple. It's like to send an email or a text is like 5 lines of code. And it's only 1 line of code in your controller. So especially with the craft command, I can craft that notification and it'll create the class for me, and I just add my logic and then that's it. And then I resolve it from the container. So for packages, like I built an API package, but I'm not a big fan of it just because I haven't actually used it yet. So it's never ever good to create a package when you're not personally invested in it or you're not personally using it. But when I put it on Reddit a while ago, like that was huge. Like everybody needed an API package. But what I was working on at the time didn't need one. So if anybody is huge into APIs, there's a couple people in the community that are, and they're going to work on developing it. And once I start building a package that requires an API, it'll be much better. So so anytime I come across my code where I'm like, man, this is super bulky, this is not good, this is ugly, I try to abstract it into a package. That's all it is. So maybe it was just like the notifications, like the email class, I'll admit, is a little bulky. So I abstracted that email class into a notification class, sort of transformed it, and now it's super awesome. So anybody coming in that sees like, man, this is weird, the API is a little off, definitely needs to let me know, and we can definitely work on it. Like for hours, I will just stare at a single line of code and work on refactoring out and making it smaller and more intuitive. And I have this, since I'm trying to picture Masonite as like an apple. I'm huge into. I've always actually been huge into Steve Jobs and how he does things. And in one of his talks, he says that you can't take a technology and give it to a customer, right, and make them use it. You have to start at the customer and work your way backwards to the technology. So all features that I write start inside the controller. So I create exactly what I want it to look like, and then I work backwards to the implementation. Because like I said before, nobody cares what features you have in your framework. The only thing that people care about is how they're interacting with your user experience and your UI. And that comes with anything. I mean, Trello is I mean, there's 1,000 things that do Trello, but Trello is so simple. Like it's the user experience of you interacting with it. Things that should be clickable are clickable, and it sort of also works with packages. Like sort of things that should work, and you have to kind of work your way backwards to that. So that's been my lead thing, and it's sort of always weird to like, do I spend my time working on a service for me, or do I spend my time working on Masonite itself? So it's sort of like a weird battle where, man, I could be building this, but I could also be building more features onto core. And as for as for any ideas, like I'm completely open to what Masonite can be, and I love the feedback that I'm getting from the community so far in the Slack channel that we run. And yeah, that's sort of the future of it. It should be in December. We're gonna release every 6 months. We do a release. It uses Romver instead of Semver. So Romver right now it's at 2.0. December will be 2.1, And then June, I'm looking to shoot for a 2.2 release. That's a LTS. We're going to try that out. So hopefully that'll sort of force a lot of businesses to sort of migrate or sort of get into Masonite. Because once developers start using it, they love it. So I just need to get them to use it, and then that's it. I have them hooked.
All right. And are there any other aspects of Masonite or any of the related work that you're doing with it that we didn't discuss, which we should cover before we close out the show?
No, I think we covered everything.
So with that, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes for anybody who wants to follow up with you or get involved with Masonite. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the Yeti brand coffee mugs because I was searching for one for a while and found those, and it does a phenomenal job of keeping things nice and hot for quite a long time. So been taking advantage of that daily, and if anybody's on the lookout for a quality mug, it's definitely worth checking those out. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Joe. Do you have any picks this week?
So there's 2 picks that I'd like, and the first one is gitbook.io. So what Gitbook is it's what Masonite uses to host documentation, and it's actually a really, really awesome service. It makes documentation simple. They actually just released a version 2, which is buggy, I'll admit. I think they prematurely released it a little too soon, but I'm a huge fan of just releasing things. Like I released version 0.3 on Reddit and it got destroyed. So, but it's a really awesome service. They're coming out with new features all the time, and it's like a really good user experience of building documentation. My second pick would be dev.to. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with that, but I actually recently got into that like a month ago. And dev.to is it's like a medium, but it's for developers. So everything's developer oriented. You write articles in Markdown, and their syntax highlighting is just phenomenal. And that's where I'm sort of putting all the additional documentation for Masonite, where I basically take a section of the documentation and I extend it out into a more me talking to you type of experience. So if you want to check out dev.to, that's really awesome. Those are my 2 picks.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me about your work on Masonite and for your efforts to build a viable competitor to the long-standing Django supremacy. So good luck with that, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.